Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our special guest today is Mark Scheinberg, founder and president of Goodwin University. Goodwin got its start in 1999, and its mission is in itself a bit different than those of traditional higher ed. It links higher education with workforce needs, which is one of Mark's passions. But Goodwin has been in the news recently for another reason: the creative partnership it's formed with two other higher ed institutions, Sacred Heart and Paier College of Art. The three of them are working together with the University of Bridgeport to help Bridgeport weather its financial difficulties. As you know, we've been dedicating some of our recent episodes to discussions on alternative strategies with experts, and today's podcast focuses on what these three institutions have come to do with this creative partnership, an alternative growth strategy for institutions. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Drum. Appreciate it.
Well, glad to have you on. Been looking forward to this conversation. Let's just kind of jump right in. You guys are going through some major stuff up there with Bridgeport, Sacred Heart, and Paier. What's going on?
Well, Goodwin University is assisting these other institutions in essentially doing a partnership around the University of Bridgeport. The University of Bridgeport has a pretty well-known history that it has had some difficulties, especially financial difficulty, over the last few years. And it finally came to a point where it wasn't sure it wanted to continue operating the way it had operated. I will tell you, I am really impressed with the board there. What happens at universities is this, is that universities, all of us, are so deeply committed. We have such enthusiasm about the universities that we each operate that it's hard for us to look at anything else but for the fact that it will work out just fine. Somehow, whatever financial difficulties we have will work out just fine. And so we start giving ourselves more and more unrealistic projections about where things are going to go. And board members of these universities who love these universities so dearly will keep on trying to figure out how they're going to raise more money or figure out where they're going to make up for some shortfall. And they normally, with all good intention and with all tremendous love of their institutions, run them right off a cliff. Because the time when they finally figure out they're not going to make it is not when it's obvious 2 years beforehand. It's usually when they realize they can't make payroll past the end of the month.
Yeah.
And it gets to be that dire before anybody takes it seriously.
And it's unfortunate because the warning signs, if you've got any kind of financial background or if you've been doing this for a while, the warning signs are there. You have to be able to pull the trigger soon enough so that it's not a fire sale or even worse, just shutting the doors.
Well, exactly. There are meaningful things that you can do, some of which hurt. And no one wants to go through that upheaval, and so you tend to want to kick a can down the road. Now, I have to say, the University of Bridgeport didn't do that. The University of Bridgeport still has money. It still has an endowment of $20 million. It still has all of its facilities. It's still operational. But it saw, after a few years of really hard hits, that its future was in doubt. And rather than continuing to operate until it couldn't anymore, it decided to look outside of itself to see if there were any meaningful partnerships that could be put together so that it would essentially save the university, its core, its students, its faculty. And that's what it has sought to do, and that's what we're part of right now.
Well, that's a great thing, and it shows a lot of good foresight and judgment on the part of Bridgeport's board, on their administration, that they were willing to look outside, because this is one of the things that I've been talking about now for a year to 2 years, is institutions have got to be proactive about changing their business model, because what's been going on for the last 100 years isn't working anymore.
Oh, it definitely is not working anymore. And we sort of know what it is. Goodwin was only opened about 20 years ago, give or take. Because of that, it's interesting when you're starting a university from scratch. Because on the one side, you don't have a lot of legacy to teach you what to do next. On the other side, you don't have a lot of legacy that disallows you from taking new directions. And so you're able to try new things. It was interesting when we became a college the first time, I just told people you had to have reasons for any decision you're making. And it was interesting. And as an example, I remember someone said, well, the drop add period will be 2 weeks. And I said, that's great. Why? Well, it's always like 2 weeks. I said, I'm good with that. Just tell me why. Well, that's the way colleges do it. That's not an answer. You cannot do what you want to do because that's how colleges do it. Because if you can name a lot of really functional colleges, then you can use that as an excuse. But for the most part, what we all do as colleges is just what we've always done. And then you can't make the tough choices to do things in a more efficient or responsible or business-like manner.
Yeah, it reminds me of Einstein's definition of insanity.
Yeah.
Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results.
Well, exactly. And so Goodwin ends up looking different. We run 3 semesters a year, which many colleges do. But if you're starting from scratch, you wouldn't be doing it on an agricultural calendar. We serve a lot of older students. Our average age is about 28 or 30. And so for those students, for them to come half-time or three-quarter time, 85% of them are working, by the way, that for us to run 3 semesters a year means mathematically they can come three-quarter time and move along faster than anyone in a full-time program at another traditional institution. Mm-hmm. It's a smarter system for these students. And for our faculty, everyone's on a contract. It becomes a long-term contract over a few years. So once you become an associate professor, you're on a long-term contract. But we don't have tenure because the reasons why tenure were created, most of those things don't exist anymore, and they can be addressed through a contract just as easily as it can be addressed through a tenure system. All of that to allow you to move things and change your operations on a dime. You can be nimble in this situation where you can't in many cases, and I believe many colleges suffer from not being able to be nimble at all.
Absolutely. There's such complexity of what you're doing with these 4 colleges. Bridgeport was having some challenges. They probably reached out to you. You reached out to them. How did you come up with this group of four colleges?
Well, the problem is that most of the colleges that you read about that are having trouble are relatively small. Mm-hmm. Most of them are under 1,000 students, sometimes less than that. Just from an economic model, a college of under 1,000 students is really difficult to operate economically. You don't have a critical mass. You just don't have economy of scale. And so most of the problem schools that you read about are smaller. We helped teach out Lincoln College of New England about 1.5 years ago. We didn't help, we taught them all out. And that was a school that had about 400 students in it. We were able to absorb all those students, make sure they all finished on time. And it becomes a bit of a skill unto itself about how you work, not just with the school and not just even with your regional accreditor, but with all the programmatic accreditors that become very, very troublesome when you're trying to move sponsorship of programs from one institution to another. In this case here, this was too large. The University of Bridgeport was a school that, they tell me about 20 years ago, had 10,000 students in it. Mm-hmm. It still had, in the recent past, about 4,500 students. So that's the number we were looking at. And there's no school in this state that could absorb independently 4,500 students itself, with all of its specializations and coursework. The only way we could do that is to create a consortia of schools so that we could step in and each of us take those things that we were most able to absorb so that it would be a partnership to try to get this thing done. Having said that, what oftentimes happens when schools close is that there ends up being an entity or two that picks up the schools and scoops up those students and curriculum and brings them back to the mothership. And that place usually goes dark. In this case here, the University of Bridgeport is pivotal to the city of Bridgeport in Connecticut. It's a massively large school sitting on 60 acres on the Long Island Sound, surrounded by another 200-acre park. It is quite stunning, but it's also a centerpiece for that city. Like many cities, cities by themselves can be troubled. And in this city, the University of Bridgeport was one of its monuments. And so we had made the determination that we would all keep the programs that remain at the University of Bridgeport to remain in Bridgeport at that site. So instead of pulling those things out, we would actually rejuvenate that campus. So we're actually each going onto the campus with the schools that we are each taking over. Bassick High School, which is a University of Bridgeport high school, is going onto the campus and just announced that in the last week or two. So there's another $110 million building going onto the site. And then the three of us will each be taking our respective strengths, our respective schools, and have that go on the campus as well. So Paier College of Art is, of course, taking the arts programs, design programs, and that's something they do very, very well. Sacred Heart University, which is a real brand name institution, coveted the engineering programs, but they also were very excited to take on programs in counseling, a chiropractic school, and the School of Education for the most part. For Goodwin, we're a large healthcare school, so we're taking over a PA school, nursing school, dental hygiene school, largely some of our major areas of school of business we're taking on. But that leaves the entire School of Arts and Sciences. That leaves the people who are taking just the general subjects. And for those classes, that's a bit of a polyglot. That's a bit of a mix. And so those students are actually being parceled off between these partner institutions where it makes the most sense. It seems to me that chemistry and physics feed engineering. And at the same time, some of the biosciences, feed the health sciences. And so there are reasons why they will be pointed in one direction or another. So we were all going to do this, but we realized we had this opportunity to figure out how to spend our money on teaching rather than the backroom stuff that constitute a lot of the expense of going to college today.
Mm-hmm.
So why on earth would we have three separate security forces? Why would we have three separate people doing food service? Why would we have three separate people that are administering housing independently, sitting on the same campus? And so a lot of the backroom stuff we're doing through a separate consortia agreement where we're basically paying sort of on a per head basis how people are using the rec center or how people are availing themselves of those other services. And that, by and large, makes the expense of operating there much less than it would otherwise.
There was another university who did something similar to this, Hendersonville, and I believe it was Arkansas State. Hendersonville became part of Arkansas State. Hendersonville had they were running about a $4 million deficit per year. And just by all of, it was an acquisition, a merger, but just by Hendersonville going to be part of Arkansas State, that $4 million deficit just got wiped off the books for all of the shared services that the state university would be able to provide.
We're finding the same thing. The other thing that this can do, the three universities that are going on now and other partners will show up, provide some other interesting opportunities. For example, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to take courses at any one of our institutions and easily transfer back and forth, almost without limit. It means that if you need a certain course that you have to take before June or you can't graduate, and your institution doesn't happen to have that course available, it's much more likely that somebody will. It's also likely that if you need to have a third-year French course that you can never get more than 2 students to take, and so you don't offer it often enough, and more importantly, you'd rather not offer it at all for 2 students. If you get schools together, you can take those courses and decide collaboratively who's taking it on this year. So we're going to do that once. And let's use our resources so that we at least have a class of students when we have a teacher sitting up front.
It makes perfect sense to me what you're doing, and good on you for doing it. Now, one of those things is from a governance perspective. Will Bridgeport still stay as a, quote, university, or will it be absorbed by the other three?
Eventually, it will be absorbed. And this is interesting. As I said, Bridgeport still has money. So because they have money and because they know where they were headed, they will be able to continue to operate while all the pieces are put in place. So the University of Bridgeport is still a proud, independent institution of higher learning for at least all of 2020, 2021. Its board remains intact. Its governance remains intact. However, during this time, we have been in touch with every programmatic accreditor, and there's about 10 or 12 of them down there, so that they could each take their time in analyzing and accepting and approving the movement of those programs to a new sponsor. It's interesting, programmatic accreditors are their own world, and they're all very, very different, and they all handle these things differently. And in fact, some of them are really easy to work with because this fits in their own criteria. Some of them are impossible to work with, not because they mean to be impossible, but their criteria does not allow or does not foresee that such an eventuality can happen, that a program changes hands. Mm-hmm. And so they have no mechanism to go about helping you to make this transition. Because of that, for each of them, this becomes a substantive change. This becomes something that their own commissions have to wrestle with, and that can take up to a year or even more for them to get to that point. So what we're doing right now is we're jointly going into those commissions, we're getting those approvals, and only after those approvals take place do we have to move the programs from one institution to another. And so it's an interesting dance that takes place. If I had my druthers, I would actually really support when HEOA gets reapproved that there has to be some required teach-out options for programmatic accreditors to make sure they're on board with the fact that this is what higher education is going to look like over the next few years. We know today that there are going to be schools that are hurting and schools that won't make it. We should be acting proactively so that students in those schools are not affected as they would be if the programmatic accreditors are dragging their feet.
That should be in there as part of the most recent negotiated rulemaking. There was a piece in there about that, but I don't know that it's gone far enough.
Okay, I would agree with you. Like I said, I without naming names, I will tell you for some programmatic accreditors, it is frightening to see what they put you through as a receiving institution who's only trying to do the right thing. In many cases, it belies a little bit of their frustration maybe with the initial institution, but that's not your fault if you're trying to make things right. So.
This is true. And it keeps consultants like me in business, so.
Which is good.
Yeah, which is good, And so ultimately, it sounds like Bridgeport will just kind of be absorbed by all three. Have you guys considered doing one board for all three institutions, or will each board have its own, or each institution have its own board?
Well, each of these institutions are separately accredited. And so we have to have our own governance. And so therefore, someone has to report to only one of us. And so while you can certainly do a intercollegiate advisory panel that's working to coordinate those three institutions, they have to be very clearly demarcated between the three because of governance rules for each accreditation.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's coming to mind is National University System. They have I think it's 3 colleges right now, universities under them. They have one board for, I believe, all of them, but it is an actual system, and each college university is standalone.
That's interesting. I know that for us, what's also unusual about it is that we have our home campus. Our main campus is still in East Hartford, Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And we're there and alive and well, and we have our own 3,600 students to work through. Sacred Heart is a very august university down in Fairfield, just down the road from Bridgeport. They're fiercely independent as well. So the overall institutions, there would be no chance that they would essentially subrogate themselves to a larger board, because for those cases, they are independent institutions. And so it ends up being this project that actually has that partnership rather than the institutions themselves.
Mm-hmm. And it may ultimately come down to, in a few years, you'll start up one new entity which will take care of all the back-end services, all of that. And the universities will end up focusing on the students and what's needed for teaching, faculty, et cetera.
You're exactly right. That is the concept. And I can't, what's difficult about this is that we're trying to feel things through as we go. In the beginning, I can't tell you where we land on every piece of this one because everything changes as we learn more. And so there's a high degree of ambiguity in this whole process. And that's not initially comfortable for anybody. But if you're going to try something new, you can't do it with certainty. You know that there's going to be rubs and you know you're going to make it work. And so we will.
And so it sounds to me like you're going about it the right way. You're thinking about the right things. It's always going to be challenging, especially when you've got so many people involved. And I don't mean just the 3 or 4 entities, but all of the faculty, all of the employees. With that, I think there's far more stability for the 3, and the Bridgeport folks are going to come along for the ride as best they can.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there is, at this moment, a ton of anxiety. People want to know how this affects them personally. Some of those answers are not answers we can give them right away. And matter of fact, they don't want us to give it to them right away. We're trying to figure out how to assimilate a lot of staff and faculty. We're trying to do this not in a corporate way where they pick every third name on a list and say, okay, that doesn't work for you. I think there's some really, really good people down there. What's also interesting is this is not a parent-child relationship. This is a proud university who has a lot of wonderful people that will actually mentor us. Universities all over the country do some things really well. And all of us have things that we have as our flat spots that we're not doing really well. And so what's nice about this is that there's an opportunity for each of us to learn from the other and make the other stronger.
Absolutely. So unfortunately we're coming up to the end of our time. We ought to continue this, but we don't have the time on this one. So we'll take a rain check and keep going back. So wrapping it up, what are the 3 takeaways that you tell your fellow presidents if they were going to go ahead and do something like this?
Well, the first thing is probably even before this happens. I mentioned the University of Bridgeport had a very cold-eyed view. They're very deep-hearted, but they saw that they were running into some difficulty here and some trouble, and they decided to be proactive about it. We know that colleges are going to be in the situation over the next few years where there's significant issues around finances and whether schools will survive, and we know that some won't. And so rather than proceed on a hope and a prayer, there's got to be a thoughtful way of figuring out what happens if our budget gets blown again. What happens if COVID means that suddenly, oops, we were wrong and we blew the budget by 25%? What is our next step? And not wait for it to happen until it becomes a brand new surprise for us. So the first thing is to be proactive. The second one for anyone that goes about doing this, and again, this is our second time we've done a teach out, is that no one is happy. I will tell you that when you go in, you think you're doing God's work and you're saving students and you're doing what's best for them. For them, something very catastrophic just happened to them. Faculty and students both. They're upset and they don't know where to put that upset. They don't know where to place that. The people that they're mad at are largely not there anymore. And so the receiving institution, who is doing this for all the best reasons, are oftentimes the target of their ire. And you can understand that, having lived it, if you put yourself in their shoes. And the last thing I would say is it's all about transparency. I have 3 calls today with different groups down there just to show my face, to accept their frustration and their worry, to let them know as best I can what I know and what I don't know, because they have to know that what we're trying to do, we're trying to be as thoughtful and caring as possible, even when you don't have all the answers. So I think transparency for everybody is terribly important, including your own school that's doing it.
Absolutely. And I would add to that transparency the compassion that's necessary.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, this is great. Mark, what's next?
we're in the first couple of miles of a long journey. I will tell you that what I know now, a few months in, is very different looking than I thought it was when I was looking at it from the outside. And every day has surprises. It's almost like when you go on an accreditation visit, when you're on one of those teams where something is a lot better than you thought it was, or a lot worse, and it can be, you can't determine which is which until you get there. So is it here. So that what is next is to try to be as deliberate as you can and still being as thoughtful as you can, because they fight each other all the time. People want answers today, but you can have quick answers or you can have thoughtful answers. So there's got to be this sense of deliberateness with still trying to be as caring as possible.
And we used to have a saying in the Navy, there are old pilots, there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots.
That's very fair. I think that's very true. Well done.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you. I wish we had more time for this. I'd love to continue the conversation.
Always, anytime. I've enjoyed this as well there, Drum. I appreciate your knowledge in this area. You are a great person to have around because you know enough to know the right questions to ask. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, sir. Very much appreciated. Good luck with this, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Mark Scheinberg, president of Goodwin University, and for his sharing his insights with us on creative partnerships and alternative growth strategy for institutions. Our next guest is Tom Netting, who we welcome back to talk with us about the most recent going on in Washington. There's a lot going on there that we need to keep up with, and Tom will be here to bring us up to date on the latest news.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.